The demolition crew's sledgehammer struck concrete at 7 a.m. sharp, each thunderous blow echoing through the quiet suburban morning like gunshots. Sarah Chen watched from her kitchen window as 20 years of memories crumbled into rubble. Her children's first swimming lessons, birthday parties, summer barbecues. But across the fence, Karen Whitfield stood recording everything on a phone, her face twisted with vindictive satisfaction. Sarah had no idea that by 9 a.m., she'd be served with papers claiming her pool removal had caused severe emotional trauma and property devaluation. The woman who'd spent 3 years trying to destroy Sarah's life was about to discover that some battles have consequences no one sees coming. The sound of metal against concrete pierced the morning air like a death. Knell. Sarah Chen stood at her kitchen sink, coffee mug trembling in her hands as she watched 20 years of her life disappear one sledgehammer blow at a time. The pool that had been the heart of her family's happiness for 2 decades was becoming nothing more than chunks of broken concrete and twisted rebar. "Mom, are you sure about this?" Emma's voice carried from the doorway, her 15-year-old frame silhouetted against the morning light streaming through the house. Sarah didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her daughter's eyes again. "It's done, sweetheart. The decision's made." The demolition crew worked with mechanical precision, their hydraulic breakers reducing the pool's elegant curves to angular destruction. Sarah remembered when they'd first broken ground for the pool in 2004. David had been so excited, measuring and remeasuring every dimension, obsessing over the placement of the diving board. Their son Jake had been 8 then, Emma just a toddler in water wings. Now David was gone, not dead, just gone to his new life in Seattle with his new wife and their new baby. And the pool had become a monument to everything Sarah could no longer afford to maintain. "Jesus Christ, what are you doing to my property? Values." The voice cut through the construction noise like a knife. Sarah's spine stiffened before she even turned to see Karen Whitfield standing at the chain-link fence that separated their properties. Tall, blonde, and perpetually indignant, Karen had made Sarah's life miserable for the past 3 years with a creativity that bordered on autistic. "It's my property, Karen," Sarah called back, stepping onto her back patio. The morning air was crisp with autumn, carrying the scent of dying leaves and pulverized concrete. Karen's face was already flushed red, her phone held high as she recorded the destruction. "This is going to tank my home value. You can't just destroy amenities without considering how it affects the neighborhood." "Watch me," Sarah said quietly, but her words carried enough steel to make Karen's eyes narrow. The two women had been locked in an escalating war of petty grievances that started when Karen first moved in next door. It began innocently enough, a complaint about Sarah's sprinkler system occasionally misting Karen's pristine lawn. But Karen had a talent for finding fault, and Sarah had a stubbornness that refused to back down from bullies. Over 3 years, the conflicts had multiplied like cancer cells. Karen had called code enforcement about Sarah's garden shed being 3 inches over the property line. It wasn't. She'd filed noise complaints about Emma's piano practice at 3 p.m. on weekdays. She'd demanded Sarah trim her oak tree because the leaves fell into Karen's yard, then threatened to sue when Sarah refused. She'd even called animal control claiming Sarah's ancient golden retriever, Winston, was a dangerous animal after he barked at the mail carrier. Each complaint had been dismissed, but not before costing Sarah time, money, and sanity she couldn't afford to lose. "You're doing this out of spite," Karen accused, her voice rising over the industrial noise. "This is targeted harassment designed to damage my investment." Sarah laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Everything isn't about you, Karen. Hard as that might be to believe." The truth was more complicated and more heartbreaking. The pool had cost $800 a month to maintain properly. Chemicals, heating, cleaning service, insurance. After the divorce, Sarah's teaching salary couldn't stretch to cover what had once been shared expenses. She tried to maintain herself for 2 years, watching the water turn green when she couldn't afford chemicals, seeing the concrete crack when she couldn't pay for professional repairs. Emma had begged her to keep it. "I'll get a job, Mom. I'll help pay for it." But Sarah couldn't ask her 15-year-old daughter to sacrifice her childhood to maintain a luxury they could no longer afford. The pool had become a symbol of everything she'd lost: financial security, her marriage, the comfortable life she'd built over 20 years. "Mrs. Chen." The foreman approached, pulling her attention away from Karen's escalating tirade. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes behind safety glasses. We are about halfway done with the breaking. Should have it cleared out by end of day tomorrow. Thank you, Miguel. Sarah had chosen his crew specifically because they'd been respectful during the consultation, treating the pool removal like the funeral it felt like rather than just another job. This is insane. Karen's voice reached a new octave. You're destroying tens of thousands of dollars in property improvements. This affects everyone's home values. Then buy my house, Sarah snapped, finally losing her composure. Put your money where your mouth is, Karen. You've been trying to force me out for 3 years. Here's your chance. Karen's face went white, then red again. You can't just, I can do whatever I want with my property, Sarah interrupted. Just like you've done whatever you wanted with yours. Remember the spite fence you built last summer? The one that blocks my kitchen window? Or the industrial-grade security lights you installed pointing directly at Emma's bedroom? Those were legitimate property improvements. And this is mine. The hydraulic breaker resumed its work, drowning out Karen's response. Sarah watched her neighbor pace along the fence line, phone still recording, mouth moving in what looked like increasingly animated conversation with someone on the other end. Emma emerged from the house, backpack slung over her shoulder. I'm walking to school, Mom. Wait, honey. Sarah caught her daughter's arm gently. Are you okay with this? Really okay? Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. I get it, Mom. We can't afford it. She glanced at the destruction, then at Karen still ranting by the fence. I hate that she wins. She doesn't win, Sarah said. Firmly. She never wins. Bullies don't get to decide how we live our lives. After Emma left, Sarah returned to the kitchen to prepare for her day of teaching 4th graders about fractions and multiplication tables. She'd just poured her second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, she could see a man in a suit holding an official-looking envelope. Process server. Her heart sank as she opened the door. Sarah Chen. Yes. You've been served. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Sarah waited until the man drove away before tearing it open, her hand shaking with more than caffeine jitters. Karen Whitfield versus Sarah Chen. Civil complaint. 4 damages. The words blurred as Sarah scanned the document. Emotional distress. Property devaluation. Intentional infliction of harm. Punitive damages in the amount of $50,000. Karen was suing her for removing her own pool. Sarah sank onto her front step, the legal papers scattered around her like fallen leaves. In the backyard, the demolition continued, each blow of the hammer now sounding less like destruction and more like the steady rhythm of war drums. She pulled out her phone and dialed her lawyer, the same one who'd handled her divorce. Janet picked up on the second ring. Sarah. What's wrong? Karen's finally done it, Sarah said, her voice eerily calm. She's suing me for emotional damages because I took down my pool. There was a long pause. She's suing you for improving your own property in a way she doesn't like. $50,000 worth of emotional distress, apparently. Sarah. This is. Janet's voice took on the tone she used when dealing with particularly ridiculous opposing counsel. This is harassment. Pure and simple. We can probably get this dismissed quickly, but it'll still cost me money I don't have to defend against it. Yes. And time. And stress. Sarah looked back at her house, at the pile of legal papers threatening to blow away in the autumn wind, at Karen's house where she could see the woman pacing behind her kitchen window like a caged animal. Janet, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Of course. Is there any way, any legal way, to make Karen understand that actions have consequences? Janet was quiet for a long moment. What exactly are you asking me? Sarah watched as Miguel's crew carefully extracted a section of pool tile, the blue ceramic catching the morning light like scattered jewels. I'm asking if there's a way to fight back without becoming the monster she thinks I am. Sarah, be very careful here. I know you're angry. I'm not angry, Sarah interrupted, and she was surprised to realize it was true. The rage that had sustained her through 3 years of Karen's harassment had crystallized into something colder and more dangerous. I'm done being a victim. After hanging up, Sarah sat on her front step for a long time, watching her neighbors. drive past on their way to work. Some slowed down to look at the construction equipment in H. Janet Chen's law office occupied the third floor of a converted Victorian mansion downtown, its tall windows offering a view of the courthouse where she'd won more harassment cases than she'd lost. Sarah sat across from her sister-in-law's mahogany desk, a stack of printouts spread between them like battle plans. "This is incredible," Janet murmured, adjusting her reading glasses as she flipped through the documents Sarah had compiled. "Karen Whitfield has been doing this for 12 years. Phoenix, Tucson, Flagstaff, now here. Same pattern every time." Sarah leaned forward, her teacher's instincts kicking in as she organized the evidence. She moves into an upscale neighborhood, targets one family, usually recent divorcees or people going through financial stress, then escalates conflicts until she can file a lawsuit. And look at these settlement amounts. Janet's finger traced down a column of numbers. $15,000 in Phoenix for emotional distress over a neighbor's Christmas decorations. $22,000 in Tucson because someone's teenage son played music too loud. $35,000 in Flagstaff over a property line dispute. "She's not just a bad neighbor," Sarah said, the pieces clicking into place. "She's running a scam. She researches vulnerable targets, manufactures conflicts, then uses the legal system to extort money from people who can't afford to fight back." Janet set the papers down and fixed Sarah with the look that had made opposing counsel tremble for 15 years. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom, Karen's an hour. Backyard taking pictures. Should I call the police?" "She's at my house," Sarah said, showing Janet the message. "Taking pictures." "Of course she is. Building her case for emotional distress." Janet stood and grabbed her coat. "Come on. Time for Mrs. Whitfield to meet. The other Chen sister." 20 minutes later, they pulled into Sarah's driveway to find Karen crouched by the demolished pool, measuring tape in one hand, professional camera in the other. She wore a black dress that looked suspiciously like morning attire. "Mrs. Whitfield." Janet's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades making people very uncomfortable in courtrooms. "I'm Janet Chen, Sarah's attorney. Could we have a word?" Karen straightened, her face cycling through surprise, irritation, and calculation. "I'm documenting the destruction of neighborhood property values for my lawsuit." "On private property without permission," Janet replied. Smoothly. "That's called trespassing. But I'm sure you knew that. The property line is clearly marked by the fence you're currently standing inside of." Janet gestured to Karen's position, well within Sarah's backyard, along with the no trespassing signs my client posted this morning. Sarah blinked. She hadn't posted any signs. Janet caught her confusion and smiled. "Don't worry, Sarah. I had my investigator put them up an hour ago. Very official looking. Hard to miss." Karen's face flushed red. "This is harassment. I'm being persecuted for trying to protect my property values." "Actually," Janet said, pulling out her own folder, "let's talk about persecution. Are you the same Karen Whitfield who was evicted from 1247 Desert View Lane in Phoenix after filing 17 separate complaints against the Martinez family?" The color drained from Karen's face. "Or perhaps you're the Karen Whitfield who sued the Johnson family in Tucson for $22,000 over their son's graduation party, then moved out of state 3 weeks after receiving payment." Those were legitimate, legal disputes, yes. All settled out of court. Interesting pattern. Janet flipped a page. Flagstaff, Sedona, Prescott. Always the same story. Move in, pick a target, escalate conflicts, file suit, collect. Settlement, disappear. Karen's hands were shaking now, the camera forgotten. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Janet smiled, and Sarah was reminded why her sister-in-law had never lost a harassment case. "Because I've been very busy since Sarah called me this morning. I've contacted every family you've targeted over the past 12 years. And guess what? They all want to talk." Sarah watched Karen's face transform from indignant to desperate. "What do you want?" "I want you to withdraw your frivolous lawsuit," Janet said calmly. "And I want you to leave my client alone." "And if I don't?" Janet's smile turned predatory. "Then I file a civil RICO case against you for running a harassment scheme across state lines." I contact the Arizona Bar Association about your pattern of vexatious litigation. And I make sure every family you victimize knows they have grounds to sue you for fraud, extortion, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Karen stood frozen for a long moment, calculating. Then her expression hardened with desperate, cunning. You're bluffing. Those families won't talk. They're too ashamed of being victims. Are they? Janet pulled out her phone and played a voicemail. Mrs. Chen, this is Maria Martinez from Phoenix. I heard about your situation from your lawyer, and I want you to know you're not alone. Karen. Whitfield destroyed my family's peace for 2 years before we finally paid her to go away. But I kept every email, every photo, every recording. If you're fighting back, I'll help however I can. Karen's face went white. Janet played another message. This is Tom Johnson from Tucson. That woman cost us our life savings and almost our marriage. Whatever you need from us, you have it. And another. Sarah, this is Linda Crawford from Flagstaff. Karen Whitfield is a predator. She picks families when they're vulnerable and bleeds them dry. But she made a mistake with you. Fight her. We'll back you up. By the fourth message, Karen was backing toward the fence, her professional camera clutched against her chest like armor. 12 families, Janet said softly. 12 families willing to testify about your pattern of abuse. 12 families whose settlements you'll have to return when we prove fraud. 12 families whose pain and suffering you'll be liable for. This is illegal. Karen's voice cracked. You can't just contact previous victims of a serial predator? Actually, that's exactly what we can do. And Karen. Janet's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Those families aren't vulnerable anymore. They are angry, and they have me representing them now. Karen stumbled toward the fence, her careful composure finally cracking. You don't understand what you're doing. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Sarah said. Quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Which is advice you should probably take. After Karen fled to her house, Janet and Sarah sat on the back patio overlooking the demolished pool. The construction crew had finished for the day, leaving behind a neat rectangular hole where 20 years of memories used to be. Is it true? Sarah asked. About the other families. Every word. I spent 4 hours on the phone today. Karen's left a trail of broken families across the Southwest, and they've all been waiting for someone to fight back. Janet pulled out a thick folder. But there's more, Sarah. Things that make this much bigger than neighborhood harassment. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. What kind of things? Tax evasion, for one. Karen's been claiming legal settlements as pain and suffering damages to avoid reporting them as income. That's federal fraud. Janet opened the folder to reveal bank statements and tax documents. Insurance fraud. She's filed claims on 3 different properties for harassment-related stress that required medical treatment she never received. How did you get all this? Janet's smile was sharp. I have a very good investigator. And Karen made another mistake. She used the same bank and insurance company for all her scams. Patterns are beautiful things when you know how to look for them. Sarah stared at the hole where her pool used to be. She's not just a bad neighbor. She's a career criminal. She's a predator who got comfortable. She's been doing this so long. She stopped being careful. Janet closed the folder. But here's what really interests me. Guess who Karen's been talking to since she moved here? I don't know. Margaret Hendricks. Sarah's blood ran cold. Margaret Hendricks owned 3 rental properties in their neighborhood and sat on the homeowners association board. She was also known for pushing out families she deemed undesirable through selective enforcement of HOA rules. Margaret's been helping her, Sarah realized, feeding her information about vulnerable families. More than that, Margaret's been Karen's landlord this whole time. Karen doesn't own the house next door. She's renting it month to month with an option to buy. An option that expires in 30 days. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They're partners. Margaret identifies targets, Karen moves in and harasses them until they pay up or move out. Then Margaret swoops in to buy their properties. At below market prices. Bingo. And guess whose name appears on property records for houses formerly owned by Karen's previous victims? Sarah didn't need to ask. Margaret Hendricks had been running a sophisticated harassment scheme, using Karen as her weapon to destabilize property values and force families out of their homes. How many families? Sarah asked quietly. That we can prove? 17 over 8 years. Conservative estimate of damages? $2.3 million. Sarah sat in silence, processing the scope of what they'd uncovered. What had started as a neighbor dispute over pool removal had revealed a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of families across multiple states. What happened? The emergency meeting of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association had been called for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, ostensibly to discuss recent disruptions to neighborhood tranquility. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early to find the community center parking lot already half full, neighbors clustering in small groups, their voices carrying the electric tension of impending drama. Margaret Hendricks stood near the entrance like a sentry, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression radiating the calm authority of someone who'd controlled this neighborhood's social dynamics for over a decade. She smiled as Sarah approached, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Sarah, dear, I'm so sorry about all this unpleasantness with Karen. I'm sure we can find a reasonable solution that benefits everyone. I'm sure we can, Sarah replied evenly, noting how Margaret's gaze flickered toward the folder in Sarah's hands. In fact, I think tonight's meeting will be very educational for everyone. Inside, the community center's main room buzzed with conversation. Sarah recognized most of the faces, the Garcias from 2 streets over, the Pratts who lived near the park, elderly Mr. Morrison who walked his terrier every morning. These were good people, hard-working families who'd invested their life savings in homes they thought would be safe havens. They had no idea they'd been living in a hunting ground. Janet arrived precisely at 7, carrying 2 briefcases and wearing the navy suit she reserved for courtroom battles. She caught Sarah's eye and nodded once, the signal that everything was in place. Margaret called the meeting to order with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We are here tonight to address the ongoing conflict between Sarah Chen and Karen Whitfield. As board president, I believe we can mediate a solution that preserves neighborhood harmony. Karen sat in the front row, flanked by 2 people Sarah didn't recognize, a man in an expensive suit who screamed lawyer and a woman with a laptop who was probably a paralegal. Karen had dressed conservatively, projecting wounded dignity rather than her usual aggressive entitlement. I want everyone to know, Karen began, standing to address the room, that I never wanted this to become public. I simply asked my neighbor to consider how her actions might affect property values, and I was met with hostility and threats. Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Sarah recognized the performance. Karen had perfected this routine over 12 years of scamming families across Arizona. Mrs. Chen hired an aggressive attorney who invaded my privacy, harassed me on my own property, and made veiled threats about fabricated allegations. Karen's voice cracked with practiced emotion. All I wanted was to protect our communities. Investment value. More murmurs, some sympathetic nods. Margaret looked satisfied as she stood to speak. I think we can all understand both perspectives here. Sarah was dealing with financial difficulties after her divorce. How do you know about my financial situation? Sarah interrupted, her teacher's voice cutting through the room's chatter like a blade. Margaret paused, the slightest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. Well, it's a small neighborhood. People talk. Do they? Sarah stood, opening her folder. Because I'm curious about what people have been saying. And to whom. She pulled out the first document, a bank statement with highlighted sections. For instance, I'm curious about this wire transfer from Margaret Hendricks to Karen Whitfield for $15,000, made the same day I demolish my pool. The memo reads, bonus for Chen project. The room went dead silent. Karen's face drained. Of color. Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment before she recovered. I don't know what you're implying, but I'm not implying anything, Sarah said clearly. I'm stating facts. Karen Whitfield is not your neighbor. She's your employee. And this entire conflict was manufactured to force me out of my home so you could buy it below market value. Janet stood, her briefcases clicking open with the sound of bullets being chambered. Ladies and gentlemen, What you're witnessing tonight is the exposure of a criminal enterprise that has operated in this community for 3 years and across multiple states for over a decade. She pulled out the first poster board, a timeline, showing Karen's movements over 12 years, with photos of houses and families. Karen Whitfield moves into upscale neighborhoods, identifies vulnerable families, escalates manufactured conflicts, files lawsuits, collects settlements, and disappears. But in Pine Ridge, she found a partner. The second poster board showed property records, houses formerly owned by families Karen had targeted, all purchased within months by Margaret Hendricks at prices 20 to 30% below market value. Margaret Hendricks has been Karen's partner in this scheme. Margaret identifies targets through her position on the HOA board and her connections in real estate. Karen moves in as a renter, harasses the targeted family until they either pay her to go away or sell their homes and leave. Margaret then purchases the properties at distressed prices. The room erupted in angry voices. Sarah saw Mr. Morrison's face turn red with rage, the Garcias whispering furiously to each other, the Pratts staring at Margaret with dawning horror. "This is outrageous." Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. "These are wild accusations with no basis in fact." "Are they?" Janet's smile was razor-sharp. "Because I have bank records showing 17 payments from Margaret Hendricks to Karen Whitfield over 3 years. I have property records showing Margaret purchasing homes from families Karen targeted. And I have testimony from 12 families across Arizona who were victimized by this exact same scheme." Karen's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but Karen shook him off and stood. "You can't prove any of this. These people are making wild accusations because they can't handle legitimate legal action." Legitimate. Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years managing classrooms full of children trying to lie their way out of trouble. "Karen, would you like to explain why you filed a police report claiming Janet and I threatened you, when we have video evidence that no threats were made?" "I felt threatened by being offered a choice between withdrawing a frivolous lawsuit and facing federal charges for fraud." Janet stepped forward. "Because that's what happened. You filed a false police report, which is a crime. But more importantly, you escalated this from a civil matter to a criminal one." She pulled out another folder. "Which is why I spent a day with Detective Martinez from the Financial Crimes Unit. Karen, you're going to be arrested tomorrow morning for mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud." The room exploded. Karen's face went white, then green. Margaret grabbed the podium like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "And Margaret," Janet continued, relentlessly, "you're going to be arrested for conspiracy, racketeering, and fraud. The FBI is very interested in your multi-state operation." "FBI?" Mr. Morrison's voice cracked with outrage. "You mean this has been going on under our noses?" "For 3 years," Sarah confirmed. "How many of you remember families who sold quickly and moved away after having conflicts with Karen? The Hendersons? The Park family? The Williamses?" Hands went up around the room. Sarah counted 8 families. 8 families who'd been driven from their homes by the woman sitting in the front row, looking like she was about to vomit. Mrs. Garcia stood up, her voice shaking with anger. "Karen Whitfield called animal control on our dog 6 times last year. She said he was dangerous, but he's a 12-year-old beagle who can barely walk to his food bowl. She filed a complaint about our teenage daughter's birthday party," added Mr. Pratt. "Claimed it was a public disturbance at 4 in the afternoon, on a Saturday. She tried to get us cited for our rose garden," called out Mrs. Yamamoto. "Said the thorns were a public safety hazard." More voices joined in, neighbors sharing stories of harassment, complaints, and intimidation. Sarah watched Karen sink lower in her chair as the full scope of her reign of terror was revealed, but it was Margaret's reaction that fascinated her. Instead of panic or denial, Margaret's expression had shifted to cold calculation. She was weighing options, looking for escape routes, planning her next move. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said finally, her voice regaining its authoritative tone, "while these accusations are certainly dramatic, I think we are forgetting something important. Even if these wild theories were true, which they're not, none of this changes the fact that Sarah Chen's actions have negatively impacted our property values." It was a masterful deflection, redirecting the room's anger back towards Sarah. Several neighbors nodded uncertainly, caught between outrage at the conspiracy and concern for their investments. Property values, Sarah repeated quietly. Then she laughed, not with humor, but with the kind of dark amusement that comes from watching someone dig their own grave. You want to talk about property values, Margaret? She pulled out the final document, a real estate analysis Janet's investigator had compiled. My pool removal will increase my property value by approximately $12,000. The lot is now suitable for families with small children, elderly buyers who don't want maintenance costs, and investors looking for rental properties. She handed copies to her neighbors. But Margaret doesn't want you to know that, because she's been artificially depressing property values in this neighborhood for 3 years, using Karen to drive out families. 3 weeks after the arrests, Sarah's kitchen had been transformed into a war room. Legal documents covered every surface. Her laptop displayed spreadsheets tracking 17 families across 4 states, and her phone rang constantly with calls from victims, reporters, and federal prosecutors building the largest real estate fraud case Arizona had seen in decades. Emma sat at the kitchen table, sorting through printed emails while Winston dozed at her feet. At 15, Sarah's daughter had insisted on helping with the investigation, her teenage sense of justice burning white-hot after learning how Karen and Margaret had terrorized their neighborhood. Mom, listen to this one, Emma said, holding up a letter. It's from a family in Flagstaff. They say Karen got them evicted from their apartment by filing fake noise complaints. Then Margaret's company bought the building and converted it to condos. Sarah looked up from the FBI financial analysis she was reviewing. The scope of the conspiracy had expanded beyond anything they'd initially imagined. Margaret hadn't just been targeting individual families. She'd been systematically destabilizing entire neighborhoods to depress property values before massive development projects. How much money are we talking about now? Emma asked. The FBI estimates between $4 and $6 million in fraud across all the schemes they've uncovered so far, Sarah replied. But the civil damages could be much higher when you factor in lost property values and emotional distress for all the families involved. The front doorbell rang, and Sarah opened it to find Janet standing on the porch with 2 people she didn't recognize, a middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes, and a tall black man in a federal agent's jacket. Sarah, I'd like you to meet Maria Martinez, the woman whose testimony started this whole investigation. And this is Agent Thompson from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Maria stepped forward and took Sarah's hands in both of hers. Mrs. Chen, I cannot thank you enough for what you've done. When Karen destroyed my family 3 years ago, I thought we were alone. I never imagined she was part of something this big. Agent Thompson was more businesslike but equally impressive. Mrs. Chen, your documentation has been extraordinary. Most fraud cases this complex take years to build. You handed us a complete prosecution package in 3 weeks. They gathered around Sarah's kitchen table, Winston relocating to his bed by the window with a martyred sigh at having his nap interrupted. The grand jury returned indictments yesterday, Agent Thompson announced. Karen Whitfield faces 18 federal charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Margaret Hendricks faces 23 charges including the same federal crimes plus money laundering and tax evasion. What about bail? Sarah asked. Denied for both, Janet said with satisfaction. Karen's a flight risk with her history of moving between states, and Margaret has offshore accounts the government is still trying to trace. Maria leaned forward eagerly. Tell her about the civil case. Janet's smile was predatory. We're filing a class action lawsuit representing all 17 families Karen and Margaret victimized. Conservative estimate of damages is $12 million, but with punitive damages for the deliberate and systematic nature of the fraud, we could be looking at 30 to 40 million. Emma's eyes widened. They have that much money. Margaret does, Agent Thompson confirmed. She's been buying properties with fraudulent financing for years, using fake documentation and inflated appraisals. Her real estate empire is worth about $60 million, but it's all built on lies. Sarah felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was coming, but it couldn't undo the years of stress, the families driven from their homes, the marriages strained by financial pressure, the children who'd grown up in households poisoned by conflict they didn't understand. There's something else, Agent Thompson said, his expression growing more serious. Karen's been cooperating with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She's given us information about other operations like this one running in Nevada, Colorado, and Texas. Other operations. Sarah's blood ran cold. This isn't just Margaret and Karen, Mrs. Chen. They are part of a network. Real estate investors have been hiring people like Karen to systematically destabilize neighborhoods, create artificial distress markets, then buy properties cheap for development projects. Maria's face was grim. How many families? Potentially. Hundreds. We are still investigating, but Karen's given us names, locations, bank records. This could be the biggest real estate fraud conspiracy in US history. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What had started as Sarah's refusal to be bullied by a neighbor had uncovered a criminal enterprise spanning multiple states and involving millions of dollars in fraud. The media's been calling about interviews, Janet said finally. 60 Minutes. CNN, the Arizona Republic. Your story is going national, Sarah. I don't want to be famous for this, Sarah said quietly. I just wanted Karen to leave my family alone. I understand. But your story gives hope to other victims. When people see that it's possible to fight back and win, it encourages them to come forward with their own experiences. Emma looked up from the documents she'd been sorting. Mom, what's going to happen to our neighborhood now? With Margaret gone, who's going to run the HOA? It was a good question. Margaret had controlled Pine Ridge's homeowner association for a decade, making all the major decisions about community policies, contractor selections, and neighborhood development. Her arrest had left a power vacuum that was already causing problems. Actually, Agent Thompson said, that's part of why I'm here. The government is going to need someone to serve as interim HOA president while we sort out the legal and financial mess Margaret left behind. Someone trustworthy, organized, and familiar with the community. Sarah realized they were all looking at her. Oh no, absolutely not. I'm a teacher, not a community organizer. You coordinated the investigation that exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud conspiracy, Janet pointed out. I think you can handle scheduling pool maintenance and approving paint colors. It's temporary, Agent Thompson added. 6 months. Maybe less. Just until we can hold proper elections and make sure Margaret's influence is completely removed from community operations. Before Sarah could object further, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Mr. Morrison, flanked by the Garcias, the Pratts, and several other neighbors Sarah didn't immediately recognize. Sarah, dear, we need to talk, Mr. Morrison said without preamble. The whole neighborhood's in chaos. Half the residents are talking about selling and moving away. The other half want to lynch anyone who ever spoke to Margaret. We need leadership. Mrs. Garcia nodded emphatically. You're the only one who stood up to those criminals. You're the only one we trust to clean up this mess. I didn't stand up to them, Sarah protested. I just got tired of being pushed around. Same thing, said Mr. Pratt. Sarah, you saved our neighborhood. Our property values are already recovering now that word's gotten out about the arrests. Houses that couldn't sell for months are getting multiple offers. Sarah looked around her kitchen, at the FBI agent who'd trusted her with a federal investigation, at Maria whose family had been destroyed but who'd found the courage to fight back, at Emma who'd learned that standing up to bullies was worth any price, at her neighbors who discovered they were stronger together than any predator could overcome alone. 6 months, she said finally. But I'm not doing this alone. We are going to run this community the way it should have been run all along, transparently, democratically, with input from everyone. Agent Thompson smiled. I think you'll do fine. And Mrs. Chen? The FBI is setting up a task force to investigate similar fraud schemes across the country. We'd like you to consult on the project, help us recognize the warning signs and patterns. You want me to help catch more Karens and Margarets. We want you to help protect more families like yours, people who work hard, play by the rules, and deserve to live in peace without being targeted by predators. After everyone left, Sarah and Emma cleaned up the kitchen, restoring some semblance of order to their lives. The hole where the pool used to be had been filled with dirt and seeded with grass. By spring, there would be green lawn where concrete and chlorine had once defined their backyard. Mom, Emma said as they worked, are you scared about testifying? At the trial? Sarah considered the question seriously. A little, but mostly I'm angry. Not the hot, frustrated anger I felt when this all started. Cold anger. The kind that doesn't go away until justice is done. Karen's lawyer called today while you were at the FBI office, Emma said quietly. He wanted to know if you'd accept a settlement offer to avoid trial. Sarah stopped loading the dishwasher. What did you tell him? I told him you were in a meeting with federal agents and that he should probably find a new client. Sarah laughed, the first genuine, happy laugh she'd had in months. I'm proud of you, kiddo. You're tougher than I was at your age. I learned from watching you fight back. Before this started, I thought adults just accepted whatever happened to them. Now I know better. That evening, Sarah sat on her back porch looking at the space where her pool used to be. The demolition that had triggered Karen's lawsuit seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than AM. Microphones thrust toward her face like weapons, cameras capturing every word for the evening news. Behind her, the federal courthouse rose like a monument to justice, and today, justice had finally been served. Mrs. Chen, how do you feel about the verdict? A reporter called out. Sarah looked directly into the camera, thinking of all the families watching from across the country. Families who'd been targeted, harassed, and driven from their homes by predators like Karen and Margaret. Families who needed to know that fighting back was possible. I feel like the system worked the way it's supposed to work, she said clearly. When people stand together and refuse to be victims, bullies lose their power. The verdict had been everything Sarah had hoped for. And more. Karen Whitfield, guilty on all 18 federal charges, sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 8 years. Margaret Hendricks, guilty on 23 charges, sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $47 million in restitution to victims. But the numbers barely told the real story. Janet appeared at Sarah's shoulder, her briefcase heavy with documents that had changed everything. The civil settlement was finalized this morning, she murmured. $68 million total. Every family they victimized will be fully compensated, plus punitive damages. And the other operations Agent Thompson mentioned. 17 arrests across 6 states so far. The task force you helped create has identified over 300 victims and recovered more than $200 million in fraudulent real estate transactions. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the magnitude sink in. What had started with her refusal to be intimidated by a neighbor's lawsuit had become a national investigation that had protected hundreds of families from financial ruin. Mrs. Chen. Another reporter pushed forward. Sources say you're writing a book about your experience. What message do you want to send to other victims of harassment? Sarah smiled, thinking of the manuscript on her kitchen table, half memoir, half handbook for fighting back against predators who use the legal system as a weapon. The message is simple: document everything, never fight alone, and remember that bullies count on your silence. When you find your voice, you find your power. The press conference ended, and Sarah walked to her car with Emma, who'd insisted on being present for the verdict. Her daughter had grown 3 inches and gained a lifetime of wisdom over the past 8 months, transforming from a girl who'd begged to keep their pool into a young woman who understood that some things were worth more than material possessions. Mom, there's something I need to tell you, Emma said as they drove home. I've been thinking about what I want to study in college. Oh. Criminal justice. I want to be a prosecutor. I want to put people like Karen and Margaret in prison where they belong. Sarah's heart swelled with pride and a touch of worry. That's a hard path, sweetheart. You'll see a lot of ugly things, deal with people who've been hurt in ways you can't imagine. I know, but I also know that one person standing up can change everything. You taught me that. They drove through Pine Ridge, past houses where families could finally live in peace. The neighborhood had been transformed in ways that went beyond rising property values. There were new families moving in, drawn by the community's reputation for standing together against predators. The HOA meetings Sarah still ran were models of transparency and democracy, with decisions made collectively rather than by one person's whim. Karen's former rental house stood empty, its for sale sign a monument to the consequences of choosing the wrong victims. Margaret's house had been seized by the government and would be auctioned next month, with proceeds going to victim compensation. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah looked at her backyard where green grass now covered the space her pool had once occupied. Emma had been right all those months ago. It did feel like Karen had won when the pool came down. But Emma had also been wrong about what winning really meant. Karen had thought she was getting a pool removal lawsuit that would net her an easy $15,000. Instead, she'd gotten a federal prison sentence and the destruction of a criminal empire that had taken her over a decade to build. Margaret had thought she was manipulating another vulnerable family into selling their home at a loss. Instead, she'd targeted a teacher who knew how to research, document, and build cases against bullies, skills that had cost Margaret her freedom and every dollar she'd stolen over 20 years of fraud. Mrs. Chen. Sarah turned to see a young woman approaching from the sidewalk. She was in her 20s, professionally dressed, with the kind of nervous energy that came from carrying important news. "I'm Rebecca Martinez, Maria's daughter. My mom asked me to give you this." She handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a photograph of Maria with her family at their son's college graduation, all of them smiling broadly. On the back, Maria had written, "This is what victory looks like. Thank you for showing us that fighting back was possible. With love and gratitude, the Martinez family." There was also a letter from Maria herself. "Dear Sarah, I know I've thanked you many times, but I need to say it again. When Karen destroyed our family 3 years ago, I thought we would never recover. The legal bills, the stress, the constant fear, it nearly broke us apart. But your courage in fighting back gave me the strength to contact the FBI. Your willingness to stand up in court and tell our story gave other families the courage to come forward. Your refusal to be silenced created a movement that has protected hundreds of families from the hell we went through. Miguel graduated summa cum laude last week with a degree in computer science. He's starting a job at a tech company in Seattle next month. Our daughter Carmen just got accepted to law school. My husband and I are stronger than ever. None of this would have been possible if you hadn't shown us that predators can be stopped, that justice is real, and that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to be victims. You didn't just save your own family. You saved ours too, and hundreds of others. With eternal gratitude, Maria Martinez P.S. Carmen wants to specialize in prosecuting real estate fraud. I told her to call you for advice. Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Emma read the letter over her shoulder, then hugged her mother tightly. "Mom, you changed everything." "We changed everything," Sarah corrected. "All of us together. That's the only way it works." That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen grading papers from her 4th grade class. Teaching had become even more meaningful after everything she'd been through. Every lesson about standing up to bullies, every discussion about fairness and justice, every story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things carried new weight. Her phone rang, Janet, calling with the final legal details. "It's done," Janet said without preamble. "Every appeal has been exhausted, every asset has been recovered, every victim has been compensated. Karen and Margaret are officially out of tricks, out of money, and out of time. How long until they're eligible for parole? Karen could theoretically get out in 8 years with good behavior. Margaret won't see freedom for at least 20 years, and given her age, she'll probably die in prison." Sarah felt no satisfaction in Margaret's likely fate, just a profound sense that justice had finally balanced the scales. What about the other operations the task force has been investigating? 17 convictions so far, with more indictments coming. The playbook you helped us develop for recognizing these schemes has been distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. FBI estimates it's prevented at least 50 new fraud operations from getting started. After they hung up, Sarah walked out to her backyard and sat on the patio where she'd once watched Karen record her pool demolition with vindictive satisfaction. The grass that had grown over the pool site was thick and green now, dotted with dandelions that Emma refused to let her pull because they're flowers too, Mom. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Thompson. "Just wanted you to know, the Chen Protocol is now part of standard FBI training for financial crimes investigators. Your documentation methodology is being taught at Quantico." Sarah smiled at the irony. Karen's lawsuit claiming emotional damages over a demolished pool had inadvertently created a lasting legacy, but not the one Karen had intended. Instead of easy money extorted from a vulnerable family, Karen had triggered the creation of investigative protocols that would protect families for generations to come. The final text of the evening came from an unknown number. "Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Williams from Austin PD. We just arrested 3 people running a Karen Whitfield copycat operation here in Texas. Your book helped our victims recognize the patterns and come forward. Thank you for showing people they don't have to suffer in silence. Sarah set her phone aside and looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Somewhere in America tonight, families were living in peace because predators like Karen and Margaret were behind bars. Somewhere, a family was fighting back against harassment because they'd learned it was possible to win. Somewhere, a victim was finding their voice because they'd seen that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice. The pull was gone, but something infinitely more valuable had taken its place. Not just grass and dandelions, but